April 9th, 1984. A nondescript pizzeria on the corner of a bustling street in Queens, New York. The lunch crowd had thinned. Steam rose from industrial ovens. Flour dusted the countertops. Outside, FBI agents sat in unmarked cars, cameras clicking, recording every customer who entered and left. They had been watching for months. They knew the truth hiding behind the legitimate facade. These pizza parlors weren't just selling slices and calzones. They were nodes in a sophisticated international narcotics network. Distribution points for Sicilian heroin, counting houses for mountains of cash, front businesses for the most elaborate drug trafficking conspiracy America had ever seen. This is the story of the Pizza Connection. A criminal enterprise so vast, so meticulously organized, that it would take nearly a decade to dismantle. An operation that transformed neighborhood pizza parlors into the conduits of the largest heroin smuggling case in U.S. history. A conspiracy that moved 1,600 kilograms of pure heroin through businesses where children celebrated birthdays and families gathered for dinner. A network that generated over $1.6 billion in illegal profits, laundered through legitimate commerce. And a case that would culminate in the longest criminal trial in American history. 17 months of testimony, hundreds of witnesses, and 22 defendants facing justice for their roles in an empire built on addiction and death. But this story doesn't begin in New York. It begins across the Atlantic, in the ancient villages of Sicily, where codes of silence had governed men for 1,000 years, and where a new generation of mafiosi was about to revolutionize organized crime. Chapter 1. The Sicilian Foundation. Sicily, early 1970s. The island emerged from decades of upheaval. World War II had devastated its infrastructure. Post-war reconstruction had created opportunities. And within those opportunities, Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, had reconsolidated its power. But this wasn't the mafia of folklore and Hollywood films. This was something more dangerous, more sophisticated, more globally connected. In the hillside town of Cinisi, near Palermo, a man named Gaetano Badalamenti wielded considerable influence. Born in 1923, Badalamenti had risen through the ranks of Cosa Nostra with a reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness. By the early 1970s, he controlled significant operations in Sicily. He sat on the commission, the governing body of the Sicilian Mafia. He understood that the future of organized crime lay not in traditional rackets, not in protection schemes and local extortion, but in international trafficking, specifically in heroin. The logic was simple, brutal, but simple. America had a growing appetite for narcotics. The heroin market was expanding exponentially. Turkish morphine base could be purchased cheaply. Sicilian chemists could refine it into high-grade heroin. And the profits were astronomical. A kilogram of morphine base purchased in Turkey for $5,000 could be refined into heroin and sold in New York for $200,000. Perhaps more. The markup was 40 to 1, 50 to 1. The numbers were intoxicating. But Badalamenti wasn't the only mafioso who recognized this opportunity. In Palermo, the Inzerillo family, led by Salvatore Inzerillo, controlled lucrative territories. Salvatore Totò Catalano, born in Cimina in 1941, represented the younger generation, ambitious, connected, willing to embrace the American market. The Contrera Caruana clan, operating between Sicily and Venezuela, provided crucial South American connections. And in the background, the Corleonesi, the mafia faction from Corleone, watched, calculated, and waited for their moment. These men shared a vision. Heroin would flow from the Middle East through Sicily to America. Pizza parlors would serve as perfect fronts. Italian immigrants operated them throughout New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia. They were cash businesses. They had legitimate reasons for frequent deliveries and pickups. They employed trusted paesani, fellow Sicilians, who understood omertà, the code of silence. And they were invisible. Who would suspect a neighborhood pizzeria of being a distribution hub for narcotics? The infrastructure was already in place. Sicilian immigrants had been opening pizza parlors across America throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Many were legitimate businessmen seeking opportunity. But some Some were connected. Some answered to bosses back in Sicily. Some understood that a pizza delivery could carry more than mushrooms and pepperoni. Chapter 2. The Transatlantic Bridge. The operation required precision. First, morphine base had to be acquired. Turkey served as the primary source. In the 1970s, despite international pressure and the so-called French connection being dismantled, Turkish farmers still cultivated opium poppies. Middlemen still sold morphine base to whoever had cash. Sicilian buyers traveled to Istanbul, to Ankara, to remote villages. They negotiated, they paid, they arranged transport. The morphine base traveled by ship, by truck, by courier. It crossed borders. It moved through the Balkans, through Greece, across the Mediterranean. It arrived in Sicily, and in Sicily, in clandestine laboratories hidden in farmhouses and warehouses, chemists transformed it. These weren't crude operations. Sicilian chemists had learned from the French. They understood the chemistry of acetylation, the process of converting morphine into diacetylmorphine, pure heroin. They used acetic anhydride. They controlled temperatures precisely. They purified the product through multiple stages. The result was heroin of exceptional quality. 90% pure, sometimes higher. On American streets, dealers typically cut heroin down to 20%, 30% purity. Sicilian heroin started at 90. This wasn't just a product, it was a weapon. It was more potent, more addictive, more profitable than anything competitors could offer. But manufacturing was only half the challenge. The heroin had to reach America, and it had to arrive undetected. Salvatore Catalano became a crucial figure in this equation. In 1961, Catalano had immigrated to New York. He settled in Queens. He opened a bakery, Pronto Demolition and Salvage. Later, he became involved with pizzerias. He maintained ties to Sicily, and by the mid-1970s, he served as the American point man for the Sicilian trafficking operation. He reported to bosses in Palermo. He coordinated with other Sicilian immigrants in New York. He managed distribution. He oversaw money laundering. He was, in every practical sense, the operational commander of the American end of the pizza connection. The heroin traveled to America through various routes. Sometimes it was hidden in shipments of legitimate goods, olive oil cans, food containers, machinery. Sometimes it was carried by couriers, sewn into clothing, or hidden in false-bottomed suitcases. Sometimes it was smuggled through cargo containers at ports. The methods varied deliberately. Repetition created patterns. Patterns attracted attention. The Sicilian traffickers understood operational security. They rotated methods. They used different ports. They constantly adapted. Once the heroin arrived in New York, it moved through the network of pizza parlors and Italian businesses. The Al Dente Pizzeria in Queens, Cafe Giardino in Brooklyn, Roma Restaurant in New Jersey. These weren't all fronts. Some were legitimate businesses whose owners had no knowledge of the conspiracy. But enough were controlled by connected Sicilians. Enough served as safe houses, as meeting places, as distribution points. The heroin was packaged in small quantities. 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms. Dealers arrived. They made purchases. Sometimes the transactions occurred in the pizzeria itself, in back rooms, after hours. Sometimes the drugs were delivered, hidden in pizza boxes or food delivery bags. The symbolism was perfect. The pizza delivery man, an American icon, carrying death in cardboard boxes. Chapter 3. The American Partners. The Sicilians couldn't operate in America without accommodation. The American Mafia, the 5 families of New York, controlled territories, rackets, unions. They had political connections. They had corrupt officials on payroll. And they had the capacity to create problems for anyone who operated without permission. The relationship was complex. The Sicilian Mafia and the American Mafia shared cultural roots, but they were distinct organizations. The American families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno, had evolved differently. They had become more corporate, more diversified. They had generally moved away from drug trafficking, not because of morality. Morality had no place in organized crime, but because of pragmatism. Drug trafficking brought federal heat. It attracted the FBI, the DEA. It resulted in long prison sentences under harsh drug laws. Many old-school American mobsters wanted nothing to do with narcotics, but not all of them. The Bonanno crime family, historically one of the more traditional families, maintained closer ties to Sicilian Cosa Nostra. Some Bonanno members facilitated the pizza connection. They provided protection. They offered connections to street-level dealers. They helped launder money through their legitimate businesses. The Gambino family also had involvement, though more peripheral. Certain Gambino associates worked with the Sicilians. They provided services. They took cuts. But the leadership, particularly Paul Castellano, who became boss in 1976, was cautious about drug operations. This created tension. The Sicilians needed American cooperation but didn't want American control. The Americans wanted tribute for operations in their territory but didn't want the liability of direct involvement. The result was an uneasy partnership, functional but fragile, profitable but dangerous. Salvatore Catalano navigated this landscape carefully. He met with American mobsters. He paid what needed to be paid. He showed respect. But he maintained Sicilian independence. The pizza connection was a Sicilian operation. The profits flowed to Sicily. The Sicilian bosses made the decisions. Chapter 4. The Money Problem. By the late 1970s, the pizza connection faced an unexpected crisis. Not a shortage of heroin, not law enforcement pressure, money, too much money. The operation was generating millions of dollars per month in cash, small bills, 20s, 50s, hundreds. The currency of street-level drug transactions. The money accumulated faster than it could be laundered. It piled up in basements, in safes, in apartments. It became a logistical nightmare. How do you transport $5 million in $20 bills? How do you deposit it without attracting attention? How do you convert American cash into assets in Sicily? The answer was sophisticated money laundering. Multiple layers, multiple countries, multiple financial institutions. The first layer was the pizza parlors themselves. Cash-intensive businesses were perfect for laundering. A pizzeria might legitimately generate $50,000 per month in revenue. If you added an extra $50,000 in drug proceeds, who would know? The challenge was making it look real. So the conspirators created false receipts. They logged phantom customers. They inflated ingredient purchases. They hired phantom employees and paid them with drug money, which they then kicked back. The laundering was creative, detailed, and difficult to detect, but the scale of the operation exceeded what pizza parlors could plausibly wash. The conspirators needed additional methods. Enter the financial brokers. Men like Franco Della Torre and Pietro Alfano served as professional money launderers. They operated currency exchange businesses. They had connections to banks in New York, in Switzerland, in Italy. They understood international finance. They knew how to structure transactions to avoid reporting requirements. They knew which banks asked questions and which didn't. The process worked like this. The cash was collected from street dealers by couriers. The couriers brought it to counting houses, often apartments rented by the organization. There, trusted individuals counted the money, sorted it, prepared it for deposit. The money was then divided into smaller amounts, under $10,000, to avoid triggering mandatory reporting laws. These smaller amounts were deposited into various bank accounts held by shell companies, by strawmen, by individuals with no obvious criminal connections. Once in the banking system, the money was wired internationally. It moved from New York to Switzerland, from Switzerland to Italy, from Italy to offshore accounts. It passed through multiple institutions, multiple countries, multiple layers of transactions. By the time it arrived in Sicily, it had been cleaned. It had been transformed from drug proceeds into legitimate appearing capital. The sophistication was remarkable. This wasn't crude criminals stuffing cash into suitcases. This was financial engineering. This was the globalization of organized crime. The Sicilian Mafia was pioneering techniques that would later be adopted by cartels, by terrorist organizations, by corrupt governments worldwide. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates vulnerabilities. Every transaction left a trace. Every wire transfer was documented. Every bank account had records. The conspirators believed the sheer volume of transactions would bury the trail. They believed that law enforcement lacked the resources, the expertise, the international cooperation to follow the money. They were wrong. Chapter 5. The investigation begins. Federal law enforcement didn't stumble onto the pizza connection through brilliant detective work or lucky breaks. They were methodically building cases against organized crime when patterns began to emerge. Strange patterns. Financial patterns that didn't make sense. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force in New York, established in the late 1970s, was already monitoring the 5 families. Agents conducted surveillance. They ran wiretaps. They cultivated informants. They were familiar with the traditional operations of American mobsters. They knew the gambling operations, the loan sharking, the labor racketeering. But they started noticing something different. Sicilian names, Sicilian accents, pizza parlors, and enormous amounts of cash moving through these small businesses. Special Agent Carmine Russo became one of the key investigators. A veteran FBI agent with experience in organized crime cases, Russo spoke Italian. He understood Italian culture. He recognized that these Sicilian immigrants weren't just another crew working for the American families. They were something separate, something organized, something significant. The Drug Enforcement Administration was also circling. DEA agents were tracking heroin distribution networks in New York. They noticed high-quality heroin flooding the streets. They traced some of it back to Sicilian distributors. They began to suspect a major importation network. The breakthrough came through surveillance and informants. In 1979, law enforcement began intensively monitoring several individuals: Salvatore Catalano, Giuseppe Ganci, his cousin, Filippo Casamento. These men owned or worked in pizza parlors. They had no obvious sources of legitimate wealth, yet they lived comfortably. They made frequent trips to Sicily. They met with known mafiosi. The surveillance was painstaking. Agents sat in cars for hours, photographing everyone who entered and left certain businesses. They noted license plates. They tracked movements. They recorded meetings. Slowly, a network emerged. Connections appeared. The same individuals meeting repeatedly, cash changing hands, trips to airports, calls to Italy. But surveillance wasn't enough. They needed evidence. They needed to understand the operation. They needed to follow the money. This is where the investigation became revolutionary. The pizza connection case would pioneer the use of financial forensics in organized crime prosecution. Federal prosecutors, working with FBI and DEA agents, obtained subpoenas for bank records. Hundreds of bank records, thousands of transactions. They analyzed wire transfers. They traced accounts. They identified shell companies. They mapped money flows across international borders. The financial analysis revealed the scope. Millions of dollars moving through pizza parlors, wire transfers to Switzerland, accounts in Italy, a sophisticated money laundering apparatus. But it also revealed vulnerabilities. The conspirators had been careful, but not perfect. Some transactions were large enough to trigger reporting requirements. Some wire transfers had obvious patterns. Some shell companies had suspicious ownership structures. By 1980, federal investigators understood they were looking at something unprecedented. Not just a drug ring, not just a money laundering operation, an international criminal enterprise connecting Sicily to New York, involving hundreds of individuals, moving tons of heroin, generating hundreds of millions of dollars. They called it the Pizza Connection. Chapter 6. The wiretaps. To build a prosecutable case, investigators needed more than financial records and surveillance photos. They needed to hear the conspirators talking. They needed wiretaps. Obtaining authorization for wiretaps required convincing federal judges that probable cause existed. The FBI and DEA prepared extensive affidavits. They documented the surveillance. They presented the financial analysis. They demonstrated that these individuals were likely engaged in criminal activity. Judges approved the wiretaps. Starting in 1980, federal agents began listening to phone conversations. Dozens of phones, hundreds of conversations, thousands of hours of recordings. The challenge was immediate. Language. The conspirators spoke Sicilian dialect, not standard Italian. Sicilian dialect is nearly incomprehensible to speakers of standard Italian. It has different vocabulary, different grammar, different pronunciation. The FBI needed translators who spoke Sicilian. They found them among Italian-American agents and contracted linguists. But even with translation, the conversations were opaque. The conspirators used code words. They spoke elliptically. They never explicitly mentioned drugs or money. A phone call might discuss shirts being delivered, but shirts meant kilograms of heroin. A conversation about friends visiting from the old country. Friends meant couriers carrying cash or drugs. A discussion about car repairs. Repairs meant money laundering. The wiretaps captured Giuseppe Ganci, who operated out of New Jersey coordinating operations. His phone rang constantly. He spoke to distributors. He spoke to Sicily. He arranged meetings. He gave instructions in careful coded language. The package is ready. Come by the store tomorrow. Everything is prepared as discussed. The investigators had to interpret context, tone, patterns. When someone called and said, "I need 20 of those things we talked about," what did that mean? 20 kilograms? $20,000? 20 of something else entirely? The analysts cross-referenced the phone calls with surveillance. If Ganci received a call about 20 things, and 2 days later surveillance observed someone delivering a package to his location, and that someone was a known drug courier, then 20 things probably meant 20 kilograms of heroin. The wiretaps also revealed the international scope. Calls to Sicily, calls to Switzerland, calls to South America. The operation spanned continents. It involved participants in multiple countries. U.S. law enforcement began coordinating with Italian authorities, with Swiss authorities, with Interpol. The investigation was becoming global. In Sicily, Italian authorities were conducting their own investigations. The Sicilian Mafia wars of the early 1980s had brought unprecedented attention to Cosa Nostra. The Corleonese faction, led by Salvatore Totò Riina, was waging war against rival families. Salvatore Inzerillo was murdered in May 1981. Gaetano Badalamenti was forced into hiding, hunted by both rival mafiosi and law enforcement. The internal mafia conflict actually helped investigators. It destabilized the organization. It created informants. It exposed operational details. Italian authorities shared intelligence with American investigators. They provided background on the Sicilian players. They identified connections. They helped map the organizational structure. The cooperation was unprecedented. For decades, Italian law enforcement had been hamstrung by corruption and legal restrictions. But in the 1980s, things were changing. New anti-mafia laws, new investigative powers, new political will. The Pizza Connection investigation benefited from this transformation. Chapter 7. The Couriers. The wiretaps and surveillance identified a crucial element of the operation: the couriers. These were the individuals who physically transported drugs and money. They flew internationally. They crossed borders. They carried false identification. They were the human links in the chain connecting Sicily to America. One courier was Filippo Salamone. Born in Sicily, Salamone traveled frequently between Palermo and New York. Surveillance showed him meeting with Salvatore Catalano. Phone records showed calls before and after his trips. Investigators suspected he was carrying either heroin or cash, or both. In November 1980, U.S. Customs agents stopped Salamone at JFK International Airport. They searched his luggage. They found nothing. He was traveling clean on that trip. But the stop sent a message. Law enforcement was watching. Another courier was Gaetano Mazzara. Mazzara operated more boldly. He didn't just carry drugs. He helped coordinate distribution. He met with street dealers. He collected money. He was arrested in March 1981 in New Jersey, with several kilograms of heroin in his possession. The arrest was a blow to the operation, but not a fatal one. The organization had redundancy. Other couriers replaced Mazzara. Operations continued. The most audacious courier operation occurred in April 1982. Italian police, working with American authorities, intercepted a shipment at Palermo Airport. Inside checked luggage belonging to a traveler bound for New York. They found 40 kilograms of heroin. 40 kilograms, worth millions on the street. The seizure was significant. but it also demonstrated the scale. If the organization could afford to risk 40 kilograms in a single shipment, how much total volume were they moving? Investigators estimated that for every seizure, dozens of successful transports occurred. The 40 kilograms seized in Palermo represented one interdiction. How many other shipments had arrived safely in New York that month? That year, the couriers took risks, but they were compensated. A successful run might pay $10,000, $20,000. For a Sicilian immigrant with limited opportunities, the money was life-changing. And the risks, while real, seemed manageable. Thousands of passengers passed through airports daily. Customs inspections were random. The odds were in the courier's favor. But every courier was a potential vulnerability. Every arrest created a possible informant. Every seizure provided evidence. The organization tried to insulate itself. Couriers didn't know the bosses. They received instructions through intermediaries. They were told only what they needed to know. If caught, they couldn't provide much information, or so the bosses hoped. Chapter 8. The surveillance net tightens. By 1982, federal investigators had identified the key players. Salvatore Catalano in New York, Giuseppe Ganci in New Jersey, Gaetano Badalamenti, now in hiding but still directing operations remotely, the Contrara Caruana organization in South America, dozens of pizza parlor operators and distributors, hundreds of associates, couriers, money launderers. The FBI established dedicated surveillance teams. Agents followed targets 24/7. They photographed meetings. They tracked cars. They documented every movement. The operation required enormous resources. Dozens of agents, round-the-clock shifts, coordination across multiple cities. One surveillance target was Ganci's Pizzeria in New Jersey. Agents watched from unmarked vehicles parked nearby. They noted every visitor. One regular visitor was Giuseppe Lambertini, who operated a pizzeria in Pennsylvania. Another was Salvatore Greco, connected to operations in Florida. The surveillance showed a network. These men were coordinating. They were collaborating. They were running an organization. In October 1982, surveillance teams observed a significant meeting. Multiple high-level figures gathering at a pizzeria in Brooklyn. Catalano was there. Ganci, several others. The meeting lasted hours. No one could hear what was discussed, but the gathering itself was evidence. These men were coordinating something. Given what investigators knew about their activities, it had to be significant. The wiretaps continued producing valuable intelligence. A call in November 1982 discussed a large shipment arriving soon. Cross-referenced with other intelligence, agents suspected a major heroin delivery was planned. They alerted customs. They increased surveillance at ports and airports. But the shipment, if it existed, wasn't intercepted. Either it arrived through a method they weren't monitoring, or the conspirators, sensing attention, aborted the operation. This was the constant frustration. Investigators knew the operation existed. They understood its scope. But catching the conspirators with drugs or cash in hand, making arrests that would stand up in court, was extraordinarily difficult. The conspirators were careful. They used counter-surveillance. They changed phones frequently. They varied their routines. They were, in short, professionals. The breakthrough came through patience and financial forensics. Investigators subpoenaed more bank records. They analyzed more transactions. They identified a money broker in New York named Franco Della Torre. Della Torre operated a currency exchange business. His legitimate operation provided cover for massive money laundering. Investigators tracked hundreds of transactions flowing through his accounts. Millions of dollars. The money came from the pizza parlors. It went to Swiss banks. From Switzerland, it moved to Italy. Della Torre became a priority target. If they could flip him, convince him to cooperate, he could provide testimony about the money laundering operation. He could identify who gave him the cash, where it went, who received it. He could be the witness who connected all the pieces. In March 1983, federal agents arrested Franco Della Torre. They confronted him with the evidence. Hundreds of financial transactions, clear patterns of money laundering. He faced decades in prison. They offered a deal, cooperate and receive a reduced sentence. Della Torre considered his options. He had no deep loyalty to the Sicilian mafiosi. He was a businessman who had gotten involved for profit. Profit wasn't worth life in prison. Franco Della Torre agreed to cooperate. Chapter 9. The Informant. Della Torre's cooperation changed everything. For months, he had been at the center of the money laundering operation. He had met the players. He knew the methods. He could explain how the system worked. He could testify. But more immediately, he could wear a wire. The FBI equipped Della Torre with recording devices, hidden microphones, concealed transmitters. They instructed him to continue his operations as if nothing had changed. Meet with the conspirators, discuss transactions, record everything. Della Torre followed instructions. He met with Giuseppe Ganci. He discussed moving cash to Switzerland. The conversation was recorded. He met with Salvatore Catalano. They talked about wire transfers, about exchange rates, about logistics. Recorded. He met with other members of the organization. Every conversation captured on tape. The recordings were devastating evidence. Unlike the cryptic phone intercepts, these face-to-face conversations were more explicit. The conspirators trusted Della Torre. They spoke more freely. They discussed amounts. They mentioned specific banks. They talked about avoiding detection. In one recorded conversation, Ganci complained about the challenges of moving so much cash. "We have too much," he said. "It's sitting in basements. We need to move it faster." The statement was evidence of the operation's enormous profitability. It also demonstrated knowledge and intent. Ganci knew the money was from illegal sources. He was actively working to launder it. But Della Torre's cooperation created a ticking clock. If the conspirators discovered he was working with law enforcement, they would disappear. They would destroy evidence. They would flee. The FBI had to move carefully, use Della Torre to gather evidence, but prepare to make arrests before his cover was blown. Meanwhile, Italian authorities were making progress. In Sicily, a massive anti-mafia investigation called the Maxi trial was underway. Hundreds of suspected mafiosi were being arrested and prosecuted. Among them were individuals connected to the pizza connection. Italian prosecutors shared their findings with American authorities. They provided statements from informants. They identified organizational structures. One crucial informant in Italy was Tommaso Buscetta. Buscetta was a high-ranking mafioso who had decided to cooperate with authorities after surviving multiple assassination attempts during the Mafia Wars. His testimony would eventually help convict hundreds of mafiosi in Italy, but he also provided information about the pizza connection. He identified Gaetano Badalamenti as one of the architects. He described how the operation worked. He explained the Sicilian side of the network. Buscetta's cooperation was unprecedented. The Mafia Code of Omertà, silence in the face of authorities, had been absolute for generations. Breaking Omertà meant death for the informant and often for his family. But Buscetta broke it anyway. His reasons were complex. Fear, revenge against the Corleonesi who had killed his relatives, perhaps genuine remorse. Regardless of motivation, his testimony was invaluable. By mid-1983, American prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to bring charges. The financial records demonstrated money laundering. The wiretaps demonstrated conspiracy. Della Torre's recordings demonstrated intent. Italian authorities' intelligence demonstrated the international scope. The case wasn't perfect. They didn't have physical evidence of large drug seizures directly connecting all the defendants. But federal prosecutors believed the cumulative evidence was sufficient for conviction. They began preparing indictments. Chapter D10. The roundup. The arrests had to be coordinated. The conspirators were spread across multiple states. Some were in New York, some in New Jersey, some in Pennsylvania, Florida, Illinois. If word of arrests leaked, targets would flee. The operation had to be simultaneous, swift, overwhelming. Federal authorities designated April 9, 1984, as the takedown date. Hundreds of agents mobilized, FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshals, local police in multiple jurisdictions. They prepared arrest warrants. They surveilled the targets. They confirmed locations. At dawn, they moved. In Queens, agents arrested Salvatore Catalano at his home. He didn't resist. He was calm, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. They seized documents, financial records, phone books filled with numbers. In New Jersey, Giuseppe Ganci was arrested at his pizzeria. Agents arrived as he was preparing for the lunch shift. They placed him in handcuffs surrounded by pizza dough and tomato sauce. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Across multiple locations the raids continued. Filippo Casamento, Salvatore Greco, Giuseppe Lambertini. Dozens of arrests within hours. It was the culmination of years of investigation, but the biggest target remained at large: Gaetano Badalamenti. Since fleeing Sicily during the Mafia wars, Badalamenti had been in hiding. He had lived in Brazil. He had lived in Spain. He moved constantly, always one step ahead of law enforcement. He was, in effect, a fugitive crime boss directing operations remotely. Interpol issued an international warrant. Authorities in multiple countries searched for him. Finally, in November 1984, Spanish police located Badalamenti in Madrid. He was arrested and eventually extradited to the United States. His arrest was the capstone. The architect of the pizza connection was in custody. With the major figures arrested, federal prosecutors moved forward with indictments. The indictment document was massive. It charged 35 defendants with conspiracy to distribute heroin, with money laundering, with operating a continuing criminal enterprise. It detailed the structure of the organization. It described the Turkish morphine base, the Sicilian laboratories, the smuggling routes, the pizza parlor distribution network, the money laundering through Swiss banks. The indictment told a story. The story of an international criminal enterprise that had operated for nearly a decade, that had imported 1,600 kilograms of heroin, that had generated $1.6 billion in profits, that had corrupted legitimate businesses and exploited the American dream, immigrant entrepreneurs opening pizza parlors, as cover for trafficking in death. Not all defendants were in custody. Some had fled to Sicily or South America. Some would never be apprehended. But the core leadership was captured. The organization was dismantled. The pizza connection was broken. Chapter 11. The trial begins. October 24th, 1985. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, law enforcement officials, family members of defendants, spectators curious to witness what was being called the trial of the century. 22 defendants sat with their attorneys: Salvatore Catalano, Giuseppe Ganci, Gaetano Badalamenti, extradited from Spain, now sitting in an American courtroom facing American justice. Each defendant had separate legal representation. The defense table was crowded with lawyers. The presiding judge was Pierre N. Laval, appointed to the bench in 1977. Judge Laval understood the magnitude of the case. It involved complex financial evidence. It involved international law. It involved organized crime figures who had operated with impunity for years. And it involved a trial that was projected to last months. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorneys Louis Freeh, who would later become director of the FBI, and Richard Martin. They had spent years building this case. They understood the evidence intimately. They knew the challenges. The defendant's attorneys would attack the financial analysis. They would challenge the translation of wiretaps. They would argue that running a pizzeria wasn't evidence of drug trafficking. The prosecutors had to connect all the pieces. They had to tell a coherent story that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Jury selection took weeks. Finding impartial jurors for a case receiving national media attention was difficult. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the mafia, their opinions on drug enforcement, their ability to evaluate complex financial evidence. Eventually, 12 jurors and 6 alternates were seated. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case. For nearly a decade, a sophisticated international heroin trafficking network had operated between Sicily and America. It had imported massive quantities of heroin. It had distributed through pizza parlors. It had laundered billions of dollars. The defendants weren't innocent pizza shop owners. They were members and associates of Cosa Nostra. They were criminals who had enriched themselves through the suffering of countless heroin addicts. The defense's opening statements countered. These were hard-working immigrants. They had opened businesses. They had pursued the American dream. The government was engaging in ethnic profiling. Just because someone was Sicilian, just because they operated a pizza parlor, didn't make them drug traffickers. The financial evidence was circumstantial. The wiretaps were misinterpreted. The government was building a conspiracy theory based on suspicious behavior and guilt by association. The battle lines were drawn. The trial began in earnest. Chapter 12. The Evidence. The prosecution presented their case methodically, witness by witness, document by document, building a narrative of conspiracy and criminal enterprise. FBI agents testified about surveillance. They presented photographs. Catalano meeting with Ganci. Ganci meeting with known drug couriers. Financial brokers meeting with pizzeria operators. The photographs showed connections. They demonstrated that these men weren't strangers operating independently. They were collaborating. DEA agents testified about heroin trafficking. They explained how heroin reaches American streets. They described distribution networks. They provided context for the operation. Then came the financial evidence. Forensic accountants took the stand. They had analyzed thousands of bank records. They traced money flows. They identified shell companies. They demonstrated how cash deposited in small amounts in New York banks ended up in Swiss accounts, then in Italian accounts, then invested in Sicilian real estate and businesses. One accountant presented a chart. It showed $50 million moving through Franco Della Torre's currency exchange business over 18 months. $50 million. The chart traced the money back to the pizza parlors. It showed the money being wired to Switzerland. The visual was devastating. This wasn't a few suspicious transactions. This was systematic money laundering on an industrial scale. The defense attorneys cross-examined aggressively. They questioned the accountants' methodologies. How did they know this specific dollar deposited in this specific bank came from drug proceeds rather than legitimate pizza sales? The accountants explained, volume analysis. A pizzeria claiming to sell 800 pizzas per day would require constant lines of customers, would generate enormous ingredient orders, would employ dozens of workers. But surveillance showed modest customer traffic. Supplier invoices showed moderate purchases. The claimed revenue was physically impossible. Franco Della Torre took the stand. He testified for days. He explained how the system worked. Conspirators would call him. They would bring cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars in small bills. He would convert it to cashier's checks or wire transfers. He would send it overseas. He was paid a percentage, 2%, 3%. On $50 million, his commission was over $1 million. The defense attacked his credibility. He was a cooperating witness. He had received a plea deal. He was testifying to avoid prison. Of course, he would say whatever the government wanted. Della Torre remained calm. He provided specific details, dates, amounts, names. He described meetings. He identified defendants in the courtroom. His testimony was precise, detailed, and damning. The wiretap recordings were played for the jury. Hours of conversations. Sicilian dialect with English translations projected on screens. The jurors heard Ganci discussing packages. They heard Catalano coordinating deliveries. They heard conversations about friends arriving and shipments being ready. The prosecutors walked the jury through each conversation, explaining the context, demonstrating how the coded language referred to heroin and money. The defense challenged the translations. Sicilian dialect was nuanced. Words had multiple meanings. Perhaps packages meant legitimate goods. Perhaps friends meant actual friends. The government's translators were putting the worst possible interpretation on innocent conversations. The prosecution called linguist experts who testified about code language in organized crime. Mafiosi never spoke explicitly on phones they suspected might be monitored. They always used indirect language. The context made the meaning clear. When someone called and said the 20 shirts are ready, and 2 days later surveillance observed 20 kilograms of heroin changing hands, shirts meant heroin. Chapter 13. The International Dimension. The trial's scope expanded as prosecutors introduced evidence of the international network. Italian prosecutors provided testimony via video link. They described the Sicilian Mafia structure. They identified the defendants as members or associates of Cosa Nostra. They explained how the heroin was manufactured in Sicily and transported to America. Tommaso Buscetta, the Sicilian Mafia turncoat, testified from Italy via secure video. His appearance was dramatic. Here was a man who had lived the life, a high-ranking mafioso who had decided to break omertà. His testimony carried weight that no law enforcement agent or forensic accountant could match. Buscetta identified Gaetano Badalamenti as a commission member who had helped orchestrate the heroin trafficking. He described meetings in Sicily where the operation was discussed. He explained how the Sicilian families viewed the American market as an inexhaustible source of revenue. He testified that everyone in Cosa Nostra knew about the American heroin operation. It wasn't a secret. It was celebrated. It was how the Sicilian Mafia had become wealthy beyond the dreams of previous generations. The defense attorneys objected repeatedly. Buscetta was testifying remotely. The defendants couldn't adequately confront their accuser. This violated constitutional rights. Judge Laval overruled. Buscetta faced credible death threats. Allowing him to testify from Italy was a reasonable accommodation. The defense could cross-examine via video link. They tried. Defense attorneys challenged Buscetta's credibility. He was a murderer. He had admitted to multiple killings. He had broken the mafia oath. Why should anyone believe him? Buscetta remained composed. He acknowledged his crimes. He explained why he had decided to cooperate. The Corleonesi had killed his family members. He had nothing left to lose. His testimony was revenge, yes, but it was also truth. Swiss banking officials testified about the accounts used for money laundering. They provided records showing millions of dollars deposited from American sources, then transferred to Italian accounts. The Swiss had cooperated with the investigation, unprecedented at the time, given Switzerland's famous bank secrecy laws. The cooperation demonstrated the international pressure on the case. Customs officials testified about drug seizures. The 40 kilograms intercepted in Palermo. Smaller seizures at U.S. airports. Each seizure was documented, photographed, tested. The heroin was high purity, 90% or higher. This matched the prosecution's theory. Sicilian laboratories producing premium product. Chapter 14. The defense strategy. The defense faced an enormous challenge. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence of an international conspiracy. Financial records, wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, testimony from Italian authorities. The defense couldn't credibly argue that nothing suspicious had occurred. Instead, they attacked individual elements. They questioned whether each defendant had knowledge of the overall conspiracy. Perhaps some defendants were innocent businessmen who had been manipulated or coerced by more sophisticated criminals. Perhaps some had engaged in minor financial irregularities but had no involvement in drug trafficking. For Salvatore Catalano, the defense argued he was simply a businessman. Yes, he owned a bakery. Yes, he knew other Sicilian immigrants. Yes, he had financial transactions that looked suspicious. But where was the direct evidence connecting him to heroin? Had he ever been caught with drugs? Had anyone testified to seeing him handle heroin? The evidence was circumstantial. The prosecution countered. Conspiracies are proven through circumstantial evidence. No crime boss personally handles drugs. They insulate themselves through layers of subordinates. But Catalano was at the center of the network. He met with all the key players. Money flowed through his accounts. He made decisions. He coordinated operations. The evidence showed he was the American operational commander. For Gaetano Badalamenti, the defense acknowledged he had been a mafia member in Sicily. But he had been in exile since the early 1980s. He had been hunted by rival mafiosi. How could a man living in hiding, moving between countries, running for his life, be directing a sophisticated drug operation? The prosecution's theory didn't make sense. The prosecution showed phone records. Badalamenti had called Giuseppe Ganci repeatedly. He had called other conspirators. The conversations, even in code, discussed business operations. Despite being in exile, despite being hunted, Badalamenti had remained in command. He had adapted. He directed remotely. His paranoia about security had actually made him more careful, more sophisticated in his communications. The defense attorneys for lesser defendants argued their clients were small fish. Yes, perhaps they had been involved peripherally. Perhaps they had made a delivery. Perhaps they had laundered some money. But they weren't kingpins. They didn't deserve the same punishment as the leaders. They were following orders, trying to survive, caught up in something larger than themselves. As the trial dragged on, Through November, December into 1986, the defense strategy evolved into attrition. The sheer length of the trial was exhausting. Jurors were sequestered for months. They were away from families, from jobs, from normal life. If the defense could create enough doubt, if they could confuse the evidence sufficiently, if they could exhaust the jury's attention, perhaps acquittals would follow. Chapter 15. The Human Cost. Amidst the legal arguments and financial evidence, the prosecution made sure to humanize the consequences. They called witnesses who had been affected by heroin addiction, former addicts who testified about the devastation of heroin, families who had lost children to overdoses. The testimony was emotional. It reminded the jury that this wasn't just an abstract case about money laundering. Real people suffered. Real lives were destroyed. One mother testified about her son. He had been 19, bright, promising. Then he tried heroin. Within months, he was addicted. Within a year, he was dead. Overdose. High-purity heroin. The kind imported by the Pizza Connection. She didn't know the defendants. She didn't know about Sicilian Mafia or Swiss bank accounts. She knew her son was dead, and the heroin that killed him had entered America through networks like the one on trial. The testimony was devastating. Several jurors wept. The defendants sat expressionless. Perhaps they felt nothing. Perhaps they had compartmentalized the human consequences of their actions. Or perhaps, in their worldview, they had simply been businessmen meeting demand. If they hadn't supplied the heroin, someone else would have. The addicts would have found drugs regardless. This was the rationalization of organized crime. The market existed independent of any individual supplier. Medical experts testified about heroin's addictive properties, about how the drug hijacks brain chemistry, about how users develop tolerance requiring larger doses, about how purity affects lethality. The 90% pure Sicilian heroin was particularly dangerous. Addicts accustomed to 20% or 30% purity would inject what they thought was a normal dose, but if they unknowingly got high-purity heroin, the dose would be fatal. Overdoses spiked when Sicilian heroin flooded the market. Law enforcement officers testified about communities ravaged by the heroin epidemic. Neighborhoods in New York where addiction rates soared in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The correlation with the Pizza Connection's timeline wasn't coincidental. When the Sicilian pipeline opened, heroin availability exploded. Prices dropped. Purity increased. More people experimented. More people became addicted. More people died. The defense couldn't effectively counter this testimony. They could argue that their clients weren't responsible for every heroin overdose in America. They could point out that many factors contributed to the drug epidemic. But they couldn't deny the basic fact. The defendants had participated in flooding America with heroin, and that heroin had killed people. Chapter 16. The Jury Deliberates. March 1987. 17 months after the trial began, closing arguments concluded. The prosecution summarized their case. Overwhelming evidence of an international conspiracy. Financial records proving money laundering. Wiretaps proving coordination. Testimony proving the defendants' roles. The defense summarized theirs. Circumstantial evidence, questionable translations, cooperating witnesses with incentives to lie. Judge Laval instructed the jury. He explained the legal standards, proof beyond reasonable doubt, the elements of conspiracy, how to evaluate witness credibility. The instructions took hours. The legal concepts were complex. The jury had to understand that conspiracy meant each defendant didn't have to personally commit every act. They just had to agree to participate in the criminal enterprise and take some action in furtherance of it. The jury retired to deliberate. They had been sequestered for months. They had heard hundreds of witnesses. They had reviewed thousands of documents. They faced the task of evaluating evidence against 22 defendants on multiple charges. Each defendant had to be considered individually. The evidence against one didn't automatically prove guilt of another. The deliberations took weeks. The jury reviewed wiretap transcripts. They examined financial charts. They requested clarification on legal instructions. Judge Laval brought them back to answer questions. The wait was agonizing for everyone: prosecutors, defense attorneys, defendants, families. Finally, On March 2, 1987, the jury announced they had reached verdicts. The courtroom filled. Tension was palpable. Judge Laval took the bench. The jury foreman stood. Salvatore Catalano, guilty. Conspiracy to distribute heroin, guilty. Money laundering, guilty. Operating a continuing criminal enterprise, guilty. Giuseppe Ganci, guilty on all counts. Gaetano Badalamenti, guilty on all counts. Down the line. 18 of the 22 defendants were convicted on most charges. A few defendants were acquitted on some counts. But the core conspirators, the leadership, were found guilty. The jury had seen through the coded language, the financial complexity, the layers of insulation. They understood what had occurred. A criminal enterprise, an international heroin trafficking network, billions of dollars laundered through pizza parlors. The verdicts represented a historic victory for law enforcement. The largest heroin trafficking case in American history had resulted in convictions. The Sicilian Mafia's American network was dismantled. The defendants faced decades in prison. Chapter 17. The sentences. Judge Laval scheduled sentencing for later in 1987. The prosecution sought maximum sentences. These weren't low-level criminals. These were sophisticated international traffickers responsible for importing massive quantities of heroin and generating enormous illegal profits. They deserved harsh punishment. The defense attorneys argued for leniency. Their clients were middle-aged or elderly men. Many had families. They had already spent years in pretrial detention and during the trial. Some had health problems. Long sentences would be death sentences. Judge Laval considered the arguments. He had presided over the 17-month trial. He had heard all the evidence. He understood the scope of the conspiracy. He also understood judicial responsibility, to punish proportionately, to consider individual circumstances, to balance justice with mercy. Salvatore Catalano received 45 years. As the operational commander in America, he bore enormous responsibility. 45 years for a man in his mid-40s effectively meant life in prison. Gaetano Badalamenti received 45 years. Despite his age, he was 64 at sentencing. The court determined his role as an architect justified the maximum sentence. Giuseppe Ganci received 15 years. His cooperation during the investigation, though limited, and his lesser role compared to Catalano and Badalamenti resulted in a reduced sentence. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years, depending on their roles, their cooperation, and their criminal histories. The sentences sent a clear message. International drug trafficking would be punished severely. The sophistication of the operation, the use of legitimate businesses as fronts, the corruption of immigrant communities, these were aggravating factors, not mitigating ones. Appeals followed. Defense attorneys challenged the verdicts on multiple grounds. They argued the trial had been too long, prejudicing the jury against the defendants. They challenged the admission of certain evidence. They questioned whether the wiretaps were properly authorized. Federal appellate courts reviewed the arguments. In virtually every instance, they upheld the convictions. The evidence had been overwhelming. The trial, though lengthy, had been fairly conducted. The verdicts were sound. Chapter 18. The Aftermath in America. The Pizza Connection prosecution didn't end organized crime in America. The 5 families continued operating. Street-level drug dealing continued. But it dealt a significant blow to the Sicilian Mafia's American operations. The network was shattered. The leadership was imprisoned. The pipeline from Sicily was closed. More importantly, the case demonstrated new law enforcement capabilities. The Pizza Connection investigation pioneered techniques that would become standard in organized crime prosecutions. Following the money, international cooperation, long-term surveillance, financial forensics, electronic eavesdropping. These tools, refined during the Pizza Connection case, would be used against other criminal enterprises, Colombian cartels, Russian organized crime, terrorist financing networks. The case also changed how prosecutors approached organized crime. Previously, cases focused on specific acts, a murder, a robbery, a drug deal. The Pizza Connection demonstrated the effectiveness of conspiracy charges. Prosecutors could build cases around the criminal enterprise itself, not just individual criminal acts. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, enacted in 1970, became the primary weapon. The pizza connection was one of the first major successful RICO prosecutions. It proved the statute's value. Louis Freeh, the lead prosecutor, built his reputation on the case. In 1993, he was appointed director of the FBI, serving until 2001. His experience with the pizza connection influenced his approach to law enforcement, emphasizing financial investigations, international cooperation, and long-term strategic cases rather than quick arrests. The Italian-American community had mixed reactions. Many were appalled that pizza parlors, symbols of Italian-American entrepreneurship, had been corrupted by criminals. It reinforced negative stereotypes about Italians and organized crime. Community leaders emphasized that the vast majority of Italian-American business owners were honest, hard-working citizens who had nothing to do with the mafia. The criminal defendants represented a tiny fraction of the community and shouldn't define Italian-American identity. But the case also sparked conversations about assimilation and crime. Why had Sicilian immigrants been drawn into the drug trade? Part of the answer was economic, limited opportunities, discrimination, poverty. Part was cultural, the mafia tradition in Sicily, codes of silence and loyalty that transcended legal authority. Part was organizational, existing networks that could be exploited for criminal purposes. The pizza connection illustrated how immigration, organized crime, and globalization intersected in complex ways. Chapter 19. The Aftermath in Sicily. In Sicily, the pizza connection's dismantling coincided with broader anti-mafia efforts. The Maxi trial in Palermo, which ran from 1986 to 1987, prosecuted 474 defendants. It resulted in 360 convictions. Tommaso Buscetta's testimony, which had helped the pizza connection prosecution, was even more crucial in Sicily. His revelations about Cosa Nostra's structure, its commission, its rituals and rules, demystified the organization. The mafia wasn't invincible. It could be penetrated. Its members could be turned. Its operations could be exposed. The Sicilian Mafia didn't disappear. It adapted. It moved away from heroin trafficking, too much heat, too much international attention. It diversified into other criminal enterprises, extortion, construction fraud, political corruption, money laundering. The mafia was resilient, but it was weakened. Its mystique was damaged. Young Sicilians were less willing to join. The cultural glorification of the mafioso, the man of honor, the respected figure who protected the community, eroded. The reality was exposed. Organized crime brought violence, corruption, and suffering. Gaetano Badalamenti's downfall was particularly significant. He had been a powerful boss, a commission member, a man whose word carried weight throughout Cosa Nostra. He ended his life in an American prison, thousands of miles from Sicily, dying in 2004 at age 80. His life trajectory, from respected mafia leader to hunted fugitive to convicted drug trafficker, symbolized the organization's decline. The Corleonesi faction, led by Salvatore Riina, consolidated power in Sicily after eliminating rivals like the Inzerios and forcing Badalamenti into exile. But the Corleoneses' brutality backfired. They murdered judges, prosecutors, politicians. The assassinations of anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992 provoked national outrage. The Italian government responded with unprecedented crackdowns. Riina was arrested in 1993. Other Corleonesi leaders were captured. By the mid-1990s, the Sicilian Mafia was in retreat. The pizza connection played a role in this transformation. It demonstrated that Sicilian mafiosi weren't untouchable, even when operating internationally. It showed that financial forensics could unravel complex criminal enterprises. It proved that international cooperation could overcome jurisdictional barriers. The lessons learned informed Italian law enforcement's approach for decades. Chapter 20. The Money Trail Legacy. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the pizza connection case was the emphasis on financial investigations. Before the case, drug trafficking prosecutions focused on catching criminals with drugs, physical evidence, seizures, arrests with narcotics in hand. The Pizza Connection demonstrated an alternative. Follow the money. Money laundering leaves traces: bank records, wire transfers, currency exchanges, real estate purchases. The traces can be followed, analyzed, used to map criminal networks and prove conspiracy. The Pizza Connection investigation pioneered this approach. Forensic accountants became as important as undercover agents. Subpoenas for bank records became as valuable as search warrants for drugs. This approach has become standard in modern law enforcement. Financial crimes units exist in every major law enforcement agency. Anti-money laundering regulations require banks to report suspicious transactions. International treaties facilitate sharing of financial intelligence. The global fight against organized crime, terrorism, and corruption relies heavily on disrupting financial flows. The techniques developed during the Pizza Connection investigation, analyzing patterns of cash deposits, tracing wire transfers across borders, identifying shell companies, are now taught at law enforcement academies. The case is studied as a model of how to build a financial investigation, how to connect dots, how to transform raw data into evidence of criminal conspiracy. But the Pizza Connection also revealed limitations. The investigation took years. It required enormous resources. It demanded expertise that many law enforcement agencies didn't have. Smaller agencies, facing more immediate crimes, couldn't afford the long-term commitment. And even with convictions, the financial damage was done. The $1.6 billion generated by the conspiracy was never fully recovered. Much of it had been laundered successfully, invested in legitimate businesses, dispersed through multiple countries. The conspirators may have gone to prison, but their profits largely remained beyond reach. This reality, that sophisticated money laundering can preserve criminal profits even after prosecutions, continues to challenge law enforcement. Asset forfeiture laws have been strengthened. International cooperation has improved. But criminals adapt. They use cryptocurrencies. They exploit offshore havens. They employ professional money launderers with expertise matching or exceeding law enforcement's. The cat-and-mouse game continues. Chapter 21. The Cultural Impact. The Pizza Connection entered popular culture. Books were written. Television documentaries produced. The case became shorthand for mafia sophistication, the idea that organized crime had evolved beyond crude violence into complex international operations requiring financial acumen and strategic thinking. The image of the pizza parlor as a drug front became iconic. It symbolized the corruption of innocence, the neighborhood gathering place where families celebrated birthdays and Little League victories, concealing something sinister. It resonated because it subverted expectations. Americans trusted their local pizzerias. The revelation that some had been used for heroin trafficking was shocking. The case also influenced how Americans understood immigration and organized crime. The Pizza Connection involved Sicilian immigrants exploiting ethnic networks for criminal purposes. This could have reinforced xenophobic stereotypes: immigrants as criminals, ethnic communities as breeding grounds for organized crime. To some extent, it did, but it also prompted more nuanced conversations about why crime flourishes in immigrant communities: economic marginalization, linguistic barriers, exploitation by criminals who share cultural backgrounds. Law enforcement recruitment changed. The FBI and DEA recognized the need for agents who spoke Italian, who understood Italian culture, who could penetrate Italian-American and Sicilian-American communities. Language skills became valued. Cultural competency became essential. The lessons applied beyond Italian organized crime. To investigate Russian mobs, Chinese triads, Mexican cartels, Japanese yakuza, law enforcement needed officers who understood those cultures and languages. The trial itself, 17 months long, hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of financial records, raised questions about the judicial system. Was such a lengthy trial fair? Could jurors realistically absorb and evaluate so much information? Should complex cases be divided into smaller trials? These debates continued in legal circles, but the Pizza Connection convictions were upheld, suggesting that despite the trial's length, justice had been served. Chapter 22. The Human Stories. Behind the statistics, 1,600 kilograms of heroin, 1.6 billion in profits, 22 defendants, 17-month trial, were human stories. Lives shaped by crime, choices made, consequences faced. Salvatore Catalano, the operational commander in America, spent the rest of his life in prison. He never cooperated with authorities. He never expressed remorse. He maintained the code of omertà until his death in 2010 at age 70. To the end, he was a mafioso. The code defined him. Prison couldn't break it. Gaetano Badalamenti, the architect, died in federal prison in 2004. He was 80 years old. He had lived through Sicily's transformation, from World War II, through post-war reconstruction, through the mafia wars, through exile, through prosecution. His life spanned an era. The traditional mafia he had known as a young man was gone. The organization had changed, but he had remained constant. A man of his time, out of place in the modern world, ending his days in an American prison. Giuseppe Ganci served his sentence and was deported to Italy. He lived quietly, largely forgotten. His role in the conspiracy had been significant, but not central. History remembered the leaders. The middle managers faded into obscurity. Franco Della Torre, the cooperating witness, entered witness protection. He received a reduced sentence for his testimony. Where he went, what he did after prison, remains unknown. Cooperating witnesses disappear intentionally. New identities, new locations. The price of betrayal, even betrayal of criminals, is permanent exile from your former life. The pizza parlor operators who had been unwittingly caught up in the conspiracy, legitimate businessmen whose employees or partners had been using the business for criminal purposes, faced difficult choices. Some closed their businesses. The stigma was too great. Customers stayed away. Even if they personally had done nothing wrong, the association with the pizza connection destroyed their livelihoods. Others persevered. They changed names. They rebranded. They tried to rebuild trust. The families of defendants suffered. Wives and children of convicted criminals faced social ostracism, financial hardship, psychological trauma. They hadn't chosen the criminal life. It had been chosen for them by their husbands and fathers. But they paid prices, nonetheless. And the victims, the heroin addicts, the overdose deaths, the families destroyed by addiction, they were the forgotten casualties. The trial focused on conspiracy, on money laundering, on organizational structures. The human cost was mentioned, but not centered. Each kilogram of heroin represented thousands of doses, thousands of people getting high, some becoming addicted, some dying. The real body count of the pizza connection wasn't measured in mob hits or law enforcement casualties. It was measured in overdoses, in destroyed lives, in families torn apart by addiction. Chapter 23. The Strategic Lessons. Military strategists study battles. Law enforcement strategists study cases. The pizza connection offers multiple lessons about investigating and prosecuting sophisticated criminal enterprises. First, patience. The investigation took years. Agents surveilled targets for months without making arrests. Prosecutors built financial cases slowly, transaction by transaction. The temptation to move quickly, to make arrests after early evidence emerged, was resisted. Quick arrests might have caught some conspirators but would have missed the broader network. Patience allowed investigators to map the entire operation, to identify all the key players, to gather sufficient evidence for conspiracy charges that could bring down the organization, rather than just arresting street dealers. Second, follow the money. Drugs are consumable. They're used and disappear. But money leaves traces. Financial records create patterns. The pizza connection investigators understood that proving financial conspiracy could be as effective as proving drug distribution. Often more effective because financial evidence is harder to dispute. A defendant can claim drugs found in his possession were planted. But bank records showing millions of dollars flowing through his accounts are objective facts. Third, international cooperation is essential. Modern organized crime is global. A criminal enterprise operating in one country with connections to others cannot be dismantled through domestic law enforcement alone. The pizza connection required cooperation between American, Italian, and Swiss authorities. This cooperation wasn't easy. Different legal systems, different languages, different priorities. But it was necessary. The case helped establish frameworks for international law enforcement cooperation that continue today. Fourth, use cooperating witnesses. Franco Della Torre's testimony was crucial. Tommaso Buscetta's testimony was devastating. Insider knowledge penetrates organizational security in ways external investigation cannot. Convincing criminals to cooperate requires leverage, evidence sufficient to convict, sentences harsh enough to motivate cooperation, and protection through witness security programs. But the investment is worthwhile. A single cooperating insider can provide information that years of surveillance cannot. Fifth, financial expertise matters. The case required forensic accountants who understood international banking, money laundering, shell companies. Traditional law enforcement skills, surveillance, interrogation, evidence collection, weren't sufficient. The prosecutors needed experts who could explain complex financial transactions to juries. Law enforcement agencies learned to recruit financial professionals, to train agents in forensic accounting, to build units specialized in financial crimes. Sixth, long-term strategy defeats short-term tactics. The pizza connection operated for nearly a decade before being dismantled. During that time, law enforcement could have made smaller arrests, seized smaller amounts of drugs and money. Those tactical victories might have looked good in press releases, but they wouldn't have destroyed the organization. The strategic approach, build the case, map the network, prepare for mass prosecution, achieved lasting results. Chapter 24. The Unanswered Questions. Despite the successful prosecution, questions remain. How much heroin actually entered America through the pizza connection? The estimate of 1,600 kilograms was based on seized shipments, intercepted communications, and informant testimony. But those sources capture only known activity. How many shipments went undetected? How many couriers successfully delivered their loads? The true volume may have been significantly higher. How much money was actually laundered? The $1.6 billion figure was the government's estimate, but money laundering, by definition, involves hiding funds. The detected transactions, the wire transfers traced by investigators, represented what was found. How much more moved through channels that were never discovered? Swiss bank accounts that were never identified? Cash that was physically transported and never entered the banking system? The actual profits may have been substantially larger. What happened to the money? Some was seized, some was identified and frozen, but most was never recovered. The defendants weren't cooperating. They didn't reveal where assets were hidden. The money disappeared into legitimate businesses, into real estate, into investments. It's still out there somewhere. The pizza connection may have been dismantled, but its financial legacy persists. How many people actually participated in the conspiracy? 22 defendants were convicted. Dozens more were indicted, but fled. But a network moving 1,600 kilograms of heroin and generating $1.6 billion requires hundreds of participants: street dealers, couriers, accountants, money brokers, corrupt officials. The full scope of complicity was never determined. Many participants were never identified. They're still out there, some perhaps still involved in criminal activity, others having moved on to legitimate lives, their roles in the pizza connection remaining secret. Did the prosecutions actually reduce heroin availability? This is the fundamental question. The pizza connection was dismantled. The Sicilian pipeline was closed. But drug markets adapt. When one supplier is eliminated, others emerge. Colombian cartels were already establishing heroin production. Asian suppliers were entering the market. Mexican cartels would later dominate. The pizza connection's end may have been a victory for law enforcement. But was it a victory in the war on drugs? The answer is ambiguous at best. Chapter 25. The Modern Parallels. The pizza connection seems like history. The 1970s and 1980s. Payphones and wire transfers. Physical surveillance and wiretaps. But the dynamics it illustrated remain relevant. Modern drug trafficking still uses legitimate businesses as fronts. Not pizza parlors, perhaps. That particular method is too well known. But car washes, construction companies, restaurants, import-export businesses, the principle is the same: cash-intensive businesses that can hide illegal profits. Modern money laundering still involves layering transactions across multiple countries. The techniques are more sophisticated: cryptocurrency, online payment systems, complex corporate structures. But the goal is identical: distance illegal proceeds from their criminal source, making them appear legitimate. Modern organized crime still operates internationally. Chinese triads traffic fentanyl. Mexican cartels move heroin and methamphetamine. Russian organized crime engages in cybercrime and money laundering. Albanian gangs control drug distribution in Europe. The globalization that facilitated the pizza connection has only accelerated. Criminal enterprises exploit the same borderless economy that legitimate businesses do. Modern law enforcement still follows the money. Financial investigations remain crucial. But criminals have adapted. They use encrypted communications. They employ sophisticated money laundering techniques. They exploit jurisdictions with weak regulations. The cat-and-mouse game continues, with both sides using increasingly advanced tools. The Pizza Connection offers a historical case study, but its lessons apply to contemporary challenges. How do you dismantle a sophisticated international criminal enterprise? You be patient. You follow the money. You cooperate internationally. You develop expertise. You flip insiders. You think strategically rather than tactically. These principles, proven in the Pizza Connection prosecution, remain the foundation of modern organized crime investigation.